مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. أبرمت الصفقة بعد أعوام من المواجهة وشهور من المفاوضات. توصلت الولايات المتحدة وشركائها الدوليين إلى اتفاق مع الجمهورية الإسلامية الإيرانية حول حل للقضية النووية. الاتفاق مؤكد والتقني جدا، فقوامه أكثر من 150 صفحة، ولكن في سلبه الاتفاق عبارة عن مقايضة. من ناحية توافق إيران على خطوات أن نفذت وتأكد تنفيذها، تضمن أنها لن تتمكن من تطوير سلاح نووي لما يقرب من 10 أعوام. وفي مقابل ذلك سينهي العالم العقوبات النووية على إيران، ما سيعود عليها بفوائد سياسية واقتصادية ومالية هائلة. هل هذه اتفاقية جيدة لأمريكا؟ لحلفاء أمريكا؟ هل هي أفضل ما كان بوسائلنا التوصل إليه؟ كيف ستغير هذه الاتفاقية الشرق الأوسط؟ لمناقشة تأثيرات اتفاق إيران النووي على السياسة الأمريكية في المنطقة، يسرني أن أرحب بالخبيرين المحترمين روبن رايت ووان زراتي. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Well, the Iran deal is done. The United States, its P5 plus 1, that's the United Nations Security Council members plus Germany, with the United States, have reached agreement with Iran on a resolution of years of conflict over its nuclear program. And today I'm joined by Robin Wright to discuss this issue, what's in the agreement, how we achieved it, and where do we go from here. Robin, thank you for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
So, Robin, at its core, what is the Iran nuclear agreement all about?
Well, they have come to agreement on terms that will limit Iran's ability to build a bomb for the next at least 10 years, with provisions that continue for 15, 20, 25 years, and permanently. It increases the breakout time to make a bomb from 2 or 3 months, as it is today, to more than a year, as it will be after Iran dismantles parts of its program, gets rid of some of its stockpile, and takes other steps so that it isn't able to rush to make a bomb. And it creates a window so that if Iran cheats, smuggles, double deals, that the international community has the time then to take action, which ranges from new sanctions or what they call snapback sanctions, restoring the sanctions that have been in place, all the way to the military option.
So what does Iran get from this deal?
Iran gets relief from the most punitive economic sanctions ever imposed on any nation. It's limited its ability not only to do business with the outside world, but even to have access to international banks. Several of its own banks are sanctioned. This will open up the opportunity for Iran to get access to more than $100 billion of its own money from oil revenues that has been trapped in foreign banks. And this will be a means for the current president, Hassan Rouhani, to follow through on his pledge to restore the economy, which has been devastated not just by sanctions, but by the gross mismanagement of the previous president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad.
Now, when you look at this agreement, what surprised you?
I think what...
In terms of what's in the agreement. Then I'm going to ask you what surprised you about what wasn't in the agreement.
I guess I'm surprised about the amount of detail that went into this, even at an early stage. How much the Iranians actually were willing to roll back their program, to give up stockpiles. It's also interesting that the Americans made concessions, that there were many in Washington who had called for zero enrichment, and Iran will be allowed to keep enrichment for a peaceful nuclear energy program, even though it doesn't need the fuel right now, but it will have that right. And that is in some ways the core compromise between the two.
And in terms of what wasn't in the agreement, what do you think, did you expect to see something that wasn't there?
Not particularly. I think that this agreement is the most thorough in terms of a nuclear or a non-proliferation agreement. I think the United States learned from the mistakes of its agreement with North Korea and bent over backwards to nail down every tiny option and to make sure that the international community was deeply involved, that there were mechanisms to be put in place in the event that the deal fails.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to be joined by Juan Zarate, and we're going to expand our discussion to what might be gaps in the agreement, and most importantly, what are the implications of this agreement for the broader Middle East? In just a moment. My panelists today include Robin Wright, author, journalist, scholar. Robin is one of America's leading interpreters of Arab and Muslim politics, culture, society, and civilization. She has reported from more than 140 countries on 6 continents, for which she has been recognized with numerous awards, including the UN Correspondence Gold Medal, the National Magazine Award, and the Overseas Press Club Award. Currently a distinguished scholar at the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Woodrow Wilson Center, she is the author or editor of 8 books, including at least 3 on Iran. Sitting to her left is Juan Zarate. Juan is a senior advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the senior national security consultant and analyst for CBS News. One of our nation's leading counterterrorism and national security experts, he served in the administration of President George W. Bush as assistant to the president and deputy national security advisor. An attorney by training, he was the first ever assistant secretary of the Treasury for terrorist financing and financial crimes. His experience is the subject of his new book titled Treasury's War, The Unleashing of a New Era of Financial Warfare. So Juan, welcome to this segment.
Thank you. It's great to be here, especially with Robin.
When you look at this, at the new Iran nuclear agreement, what, in your view, is the greatest gap, flaw, problem inside this accord?
I think there are actually 2. One is the question of the verification regime and the process. First of all, the question of anytime, anywhere inspections and what that really looks like if the Iranian regime has the ability to object, has the 24-day period in which to respond, and then the appellate process through this commission established through the UN process. And so the questions as to how that actually works, if there's a concern that the Iranians are actually cheating, and there's great concern that that may happen. Secondly, it's the question of whether or not the leverage of sanctions and financial isolation will be given up too soon, too quickly. That if at the 6-month period, the year period, before you have kind of the full implementation of the deal, the financial spigots are open, not only in terms of the frozen funds currently that will be handed back to Iran, but the introduction of commercial and financial interests from around the world. The reality is, and I think the concern might be, that you can't put that genie back in the bottle, that it's very difficult to imagine what are called snapback sanctions actually having real effect, or frankly any diplomatic appetite to engage in that if it would mean the jeopardizing of the deal itself. And so I think those are 2 key issues that will likely be an area of focus in the American Congress, and certainly will be a question as we move forward with the implementation of the deal.
And Robin, when you look at this deal, do you see any gaps, complications, gray areas?
Oh, I think Juan's identified the 2 big ones. The question is, the United States ultimately is the most important player when it comes to sanctions, and all we have to do is say we're cutting off access to banks, cutting off SWIFT, the international monetary system. that has an enormous impact. And I think actually American businesses will be reluctant to go back, even if the U.S. ever lifted all sanctions, just because what are the dangers down the road? How stable is this? Is there the danger of snapback sanctions, that we put a big investment in and then get trapped? So I think there's a lot of expectation that a huge amount of money is going to flow into Iran, when there may be a lot of hesitation and people want a wait and see period.
So let's talk about that money for a moment. In the first segment, you referred to the frozen assets, the sanctions relief money, as it were, that is Iran's money already. And then there's this sort of second chunk of money from new investment or new energy sales that the Iranians will make. About how much do we estimate the first pot of money will be, and what do you think they're going to spend it on?
Well, I think the United States believes it's about $100 billion that Iran has trapped in banks. When I was in Iran in May, the deputy oil minister said they want $200 billion in investment just in the oil and gas industry, and they have projects already lined up. What they'll do with any of that money, of course, some of it will have to be used because of President Rouhani's pledge to improve the economy, to better life, to allow businesses to open, flourish, import, and so forth. The question is always going to be, what money will go for nefarious purposes, aiding extremist movements in the Middle East, engaging in building political alliances that may be rivals to American interests in the region. There's deep concern about how Iran will use that money. But the truth is also that throughout the war, throughout this long period of tensions with the West, Iran's Revolutionary Guards, its Quds Force, has always found the money. They've never really been restricted. They've always had access to income. So I think they would, whether or not they get that $100 billion back or not, always be well funded by the regime.
Well, Juan, let me ask you, you followed this professionally very closely from the White House and elsewhere. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that the Iranians only devote a small percentage to the nefarious activities. Let's say less than 10%. 10% is still $10 billion, if you will, which is, a significant infusion. Yeah. What would that do in the Middle East and more broadly if bad guys, the ones that you followed from the White House, got $10 billion of cash?
Yeah, we've already heard from Hassan Nasrallah that the expectation is that Iran will stand by its allies and will support them. And so there's no question. Robin's absolutely right. The Quds Force will find resources, but they will likely be flushed with more resources than they've had in recent memory. And they will distribute it. They will support Hezbollah. They will increase shipments. They'll perhaps increase support to Hamas, PIJ.
PIJ doesn't translate.
I'm sorry, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, some of the Palestinian rejectionist groups that the Iranians have supported over time, perhaps even more support to the Houthi rebels as the situation in Yemen continues to deteriorate. And I think in general the concern, and this is a broader dimension of your question, is does this empower Iran, not just with the funds currently, but does this give sort of wind in the sails to the regime and even to the hardliners, the Quds Force, the Revolutionary Guard, to be more provocative, to be more expansionist? Does Iran become not a responsible regional power, but a more provocative, more revolutionary power now that it has this agreement and it can put it aside and now has an economy that begins to recover from its isolation? I think that's a real concern, I think, for those who see the deal not as a hopeful promise for a new relationship, but one that gives the regime new life and an ability to expand its reach internationally and perhaps to repress human rights and opposition internally.
Can I just add one thing?
Yes.
Iran may also use some of that money to fight ISIS in Iraq.
That's a great point.
And so, this is where we actually have common interest, because that to them is their immediate concern. ISIS, the Islamic State, has reached as close as 25 miles from the Iranian border, and they actually feel very threatened.
So this general fear of what they're going to do with the money, whether they're going to use it for good purposes or they're going to use it for negative purposes, the latter seems to be what is driving a rather unusual regional coalition between Arabs and Israelis in their common critique, with the Israelis a bit more public, with the Arabs a bit less public, but still generally a common critique of what is going on. How do you evaluate this, this interesting consensus?
Well, I think many in the Arab Gulf states are worried less about Iran's nuclear capability than they are about Iran's return to power and the shift of geostrategic balance in the Middle East in the aftermath of a nuclear deal, that it becomes it was no longer the pariah. Remember, until 1979, Iran, along with Israel, was one of the two pillars of U.S. policy. And after 1979, Saudi Arabia increasingly and Egypt, after the Camp David Accords in 1978, took Iran's place as the two important Muslim allies in the region, along with Israel. And I think the Gulf states really fear their smaller populations, less dynamic political environments, that Iran may be the big player, not just in the Gulf, but in the wider Middle East, and that the U.S. will be more interested in dealing with them, the Persians, than some of their Arabs.
Is this a legitimate fear?
Yes.
It is a legitimate fear.
Well, I think so. And the realignment that you discussed, Rob, has been happening, of course. The Israeli and Sunni state interests have been more and more aligned over time, not just with respect to Iran, but with respect to violent Islamic extremist groups like Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, as well as the Muslim Brotherhood, where there's an alignment of interest across several of these threat threads, for lack of a better term. And I think there is a general question about whether or not there's a strategic shift in the region, and frankly, what America's role will be. And the real questions, as you know, Rob, in Israel about that, and certainly questions coming from our closest Gulf allies about what American commitment to their security looks like, especially if there is this shift.
Help our viewers understand this evolution in American policy. If you're sitting in Cairo or Riyadh or even Damascus or Baghdad, where is America heading? Does this agreement herald a shift toward understanding cooperation, not quite partnership yet, but a shift toward Iran? Or is it really just a narrow agreement on a technical set of issues regarding a nuclear program?
It was designed to be a transactional negotiation over one issue, but it has effectively been transformational in opening a channel that has been locked off for 36 years. And it's been quite interesting since April to listen to the language, particularly out of Iran. The Supreme Leader gave a speech the week after the framework was announced, in which he said, if the nuclear negotiations succeed, there is potential for us to talk with the United States about other issues. In the week before the deal was announced, the foreign minister, Javad Zarif, issued a YouTube video in English talking about the potential for collaboration on other issues. I did an interview with Zarif for The New Yorker, in which he talked about the specifics of Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, and beyond, that there is this appetite for the first time by a country that has called the United States the Great Satan now for 36 years to actually consider dealing with the U.S. That doesn't mean we're going to overnight see any great rapport or the renewal of relations anytime soon between Washington and Tehran. But I think that it is now acceptable for these two countries to have a back-channel negotiation. And Secretary Kerry has actually talked about trying to get the Gulf countries and Iran together in some kind of dialogue that would help deal with these issues. The United States feels enormous pressure. The Middle East is crumbling. And ironically, Iran and the United States are two of the few countries in that region that actually want to see the old borders sustained, that don't want to see these countries dismantled and broken up into many different pieces.
Juan?
This is a really important point that Robin raises, because I think it started as a very pragmatic, limited discussion, but over time, not only was there the natural diplomatic dance that created the relationship in a sense of broader rapprochement, but it was happening at a time when it felt like, and it does feel like, the Middle East and the current order is crumbling, where threats are emerging more rapidly, a quickening of the terrorist threat. And in that regard, a sense that perhaps this could be a more transformational relationship. And I don't think it was designed that way. I think it as Robin described so well and based on her reporting has shown, has evolved over time. The other thing that the audience should keep in mind is there's a presidential and political dimension to this. The president came into office having won the Nobel Peace Prize. Some mocked him for that. He even sort of humbly said, I probably didn't deserve this. But I think he's had in mind at the end of his tenure having sort of earned that Nobel Peace Prize and wanting to demonstrate that he's a president that can end wars or avoid wars. And that's been a core theme of his presidency, and it's defined how he's tried to engage with regimes that the U.S. has been at odds with. Burma, with which there's been an opening. Cuba, of course, we've seen. And now Iran.
Thank you both so much for launching this discussion. Look forward to having you back on Dakhel, Washington.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rob.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول تأثيرات اتفاق إيران على بلدكم، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.